Welcome, everybody. And Donna, thank you so much for joining us. We have Donna Young here, the founding dean of Ryerson's Law School, the first dean of a brand new law school. Professor Young comes from Albany Law School, where her teaching focused on criminal law, employment, gender, and race discrimination. She grew up in Toronto, is very much at home here in Canada. Worked for the Ontario Human Rights Commission before going down to the States, and is embarking in this exciting new chapter of Toronto's legal history. Before we get into the heart of why the City of Toronto needs another law school, let me first ask you, given how crazy making the pandemic is for everybody, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm really fine. I feel privileged to be able to work remotely. Even though I'm building this institution, I'm able to do that from my kitchen table. So I feel very privileged to be able to do that. My family is fine. My friends, we're all okay. We're getting through this. It's a bit of a challenge, as you can imagine, to build a law school in this way, but absolutely fine.
So tell us a little bit about your childhood. I understand you grew up in North York.
Yes, I did. Well, I grew up in North York. My parents are still living in the house where I was raised. I have two brothers and a sister. My parents immigrated to Canada in the 1950s. My mother from Jamaica and my father from Belize. My father was a high school English teacher and my mother was a nurse, both retired for a while now. And I've got fabulous brothers and sister and the most amazing nephews and nieces and an enormous extended family all over the United States and Jamaica and Belize and England. And it's just fabulous. We're very close knit. And I had a really nice childhood in the suburbs of Toronto.
Were you an academic superstar as a kid?
No, well, I have a mixed story there. I was a much better student up to high school. University was more of a challenge, but it wasn't a challenge because of any kind of, it was a challenge because I went to the university, had a good time, the way a lot of people do. But it did get me into law school afterwards. And I kind of found my academic calling, I think, in law school. I went to Osgoode Hall Law School and with fabulous professors, incredibly smart group of students. And I loved it. I thought the academic life was something that was for me. Oh, and by the way, I went to UBC for my first year of law school and then transferred to Osgoode. So I actually went to two different law schools before graduating from law school.
What were the strengths and weaknesses of the program at Osgoode?
I loved my time at Osgoode. I thought the strengths of Osgoode were the faculty. They were world class, still are. The curriculum was varied. There were a lot of courses to keep you interested in the subject matters that you might be interested in. I guess maybe the disadvantage, and I'm sorry if I'm insulting anyone, but there was a bit of a commute to Downsview from downtown Toronto, and maybe that was the only disadvantage. I thought the law school was fantastic.
And when you left law school, did you feel equipped to enter the workforce?
I don't know. Let's see. I guess yes and no. At that time, and it's still currently the case, when you leave law school, you know that there is an articling year that will help you be equipped to the practice of law. And so as a law student, you feel like, okay, I might not be learning exactly those skills that I'll learn out in practice, but that will come. And for me, and this is not the case for everyone, but for me, I found that I really took advantage of the kind of the small seminars, not the practice-oriented courses. It was really the ones that were, critical, feminist legal theory and race law, things like that. And, I thought it was a fantastic education. And when I went to article, I learned a lot on the job. And I think I wasn't exactly equipped, but you learn. And that's the way it has been.
You worked at Cornish and Rowland. What was that experience like?
It was fabulous. Mary Cornish was the principal, and it was a small labor law firm. It was a firm that had a kind of a women's rights orientation, a feminist orientation. So many of our clients were, the nurses union, for example, or individual women who were interested, or individual unions actually, who were interested in pay equity. I worked on a pay equity case when I was there. There were lots of really cutting edge cases that the law firm was working on at the time. And it was a really, really good experience. I was there for 1 year as an articling student. Did
you feel you wanted to spend your career in labor law coming out of that experience?
I wasn't, I think I think I did think that labor law was for me. And part of the reason for that was because labor and employment law affects everybody who is lucky, fortunate enough to have a job. I think it kind of defines the relationship that people have with others. I think it, your employment defines who you are to a certain degree. And what happened, and people spend the vast majority of their time working, other than sleeping, it's the thing that you're doing the most with your hours. And so what happens in the workplace will have some really deep effects on people's, well-being, and not just financial well-being, but their emotional well-being. And so I thought that it was an amazing area of law in which to practice. I was only there for a year. I went to the Ontario Human Rights Commission as a consultant and then moved to the States and almost immediately began teaching. And so I was one of those kind of unusual people who went almost directly into teaching law without practicing for very long. And I focused on employment law and labor law.
What did you make of the Ontario Human Rights Commission when you were there?
It was an interesting time. This was in the early 1990s. And it was struggling a bit with a backlog of cases. So there was a bit of a crisis that was happening at the time. The other thing is that it was struggling a little bit with its handling of race discrimination cases. And the reason I was hired at the Human Rights Commission was to look into the way that the commission was dealing with race discrimination complaints in particular. They had gotten some complaints from both employees, but from litigants, that the process didn't seem fair. And so I looked into 10 years of cases at different human rights commissions across Canada and 2 years of Ontario Human Rights Commission cases. I looked into the backgrounds specifically with regard to race discrimination cases, and I concluded that there were some kind of structural barriers for complainants. And some of those structural barriers were attitudinal. The people who investigated their complaints seemed very skeptical of the allegations that they were making. And I found that that was kind of consistent with what people of color were facing in employment, mostly in housing. It could happen almost anywhere, that that something's going on, you complain about it, and then it's almost impossible to establish it for various reasons. Either the law doesn't recognize it, or the people who are implementing the law don't recognize it as a wrong, or, or it kind of just doesn't fit within any kind of known legal theory. So there are, it was a really formative time in my life when I really understood the way that complainants were, the way that they were being treated in the system that was meant to help them. And to the credit of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, they commissioned this work. They wanted to make sure that what they were doing was what they said they were doing, what they promised the public, and they took steps to address it. So it was a really, really important part of my kind of legal beginnings.
And what made you decide to go to the States where you did your teaching?
So that was supposed to be temporary. 26 years later, I'm just getting back to Toronto, but that was supposed to be temporary. I went with my boyfriend, who is now my husband, who was doing his graduate work at Columbia Law School. It was another kind of formative period in my life. He was the one that was going to law school. I was studying for the bar. I got a job in New York at the city's labor department. But I also was introduced to the faculty, some of the faculty at Columbia Law School, Martha Feynman in particular, who is one of the best known feminist lawyers, legal minds, I should say, actually, in the United States. And she invited me, she heard that I was the partner of one of the students, and she invited me to her home for different seminars over the next 2 years. And it got me, I had already started to think about academia as a career option, and it got me hooked. And I applied for a teaching position that very same year, that the very same fall that I moved to New York, thinking that, I'll try, and I got a job. And then the rest is kind of history. I think once you start law teaching, it hooks you. It's a fantastic job. It really is.
Why is that? What's so appealing about it?
It is. It's consistently intellectually stimulating, not just because of the depth in which you learn the materials that you're teaching, but the research that you're doing. You can teach the same course for 10 or 15 years, and it's new every single time because the students are new every single time. I've taught my last classes at Albany Law School in the fall, and I was still learning from my students. And these were courses that I had taught for a long time. It's an intellectually very stimulating environment. I love being around lawyers and future lawyers. I think the potential of law is enormous, not always realized, but it's enormous. I found it wonderful in every way. After I finish my deanship, I'm going back to teaching. I hope I can actually teach while I'm being a dean. That's my goal.
Well, you'll certainly have huge influence over the school and how things are taught. So let's talk about Ryerson. Why does Toronto, why does Canada need another law school? And what is the sort of problem Ryerson is trying to solve with a new kind of law school?
So Ryerson's approach is fascinating. And just to give you a little bit of background, Ryerson itself, the university, has kind of a legal ecosystem already. So it's got the law practice program, it's got the LIZ, the Legal Innovation Zone. And it has already kind of taken up space in the legal arena. And I think that planning for the law school was happening for 10 years, really. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. Mm-hmm. And just to kind of give you a perspective, because when the announcements were made that Ryerson was doing that, there was some concern that we didn't need another law school. right? We have 2 in Toronto, we've got several, why do we need, there aren't enough jobs. And there was a lot of investigation into that, and it turns out that there's plenty of room for more lawyers. But more importantly, and just to give you a bit of a comparison, right? Chicago and Toronto are around the same size in terms of population, and Chicago has 6 law schools in it. And there are enough jobs for people who are trained in law. And one of the things, kind of a unique approach to the Ryerson Law School, is that we believe that legal training is important for almost anything anyone decides to do. And so we are attracting people who might want to be lawyers, but we're also hoping to attract students who might want to use their law degree in different ways, to be entrepreneurs, to be business people, to be, dance instructors. I mean, there's almost, there are lots of different reasons why someone would use journalists, right? A lot of, different reasons to be able to have that legal education. So the approach that Ryerson is taking is slightly different. It's not dismissing a kind of the strengths of a traditional law school, which have to do with research and critical analysis and communication skills, all extremely important. But it is kind of inserting into the curriculum the practical skills that lawyers and others need in order to practice law or, do whatever job they decide to do. So from the very beginning, all 3 years of law school are designed to allow our students to learn the skills that they might get in articling or in practice, to get those skills during law school so that at the end of 3 years, they don't have to article. They can go right into the bar admissions process and then immediately start practicing thereafter. So it really cuts out that articling year. And the way that we do that, this is called the integrated practice curriculum. The way that we do that is we insert the skills that lawyers need to practice that you might get in the articling year. So we have a placement in the 3rd year where our students take half a year and they are placed in a legal environment and learn, it's kind of like articling. But at the very beginning, starting in September, we have a co-teaching model where our faculty members are teaching with practitioners all of the traditional 1st-year courses, but in a different way, right? So that the practitioners are being inserted into the process from the very beginning. So it's really a different approach. And I think there's room for that. I think it doesn't displace any law school. I think it adds to what Canada already offers in terms of law schools. And, as I said about Osgoode, I could say that about every law school in Canada. They're all fantastic. We have world-class legal institutions. I'm just very happy to be part of it right now.
So the 2 things I've heard about Ryerson Law School that set it apart have to do with both a emphasis on equity and inclusion. And I'd love to ask you about that and how that, and the other thing is sort of digital innovation. And I want to talk about those 2 things. So how does law school distinguish itself as with a focus on equity? What does that mean?
So all law schools, right? All law schools have an emphasis on access to justice and equity. They do. What distinguishes Ryerson is that from its very, part of its founding principles is a commitment to social justice. Not all the law schools have that. Many do, but not all of them do. And so what Ryerson, in terms of our programming, in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the faculty we are hiring, the emphasis is going to be on how the law affects people in a real way, not just how to be a lawyer and represent clients, but how the legal system has an impact on people's lives. And when you bring that kind of contextual approach to all of, into the curriculum, it's a slightly different approach. This does not mean that those really important doctrinal parts of law school will be ignored. It means that they will be supplemented from the very beginning. We've taken in, kind of informal surveys of our students, and 50% of them, more than 50% of them, are interested in human rights law. That's a high number. I don't know that it's that like that in other law schools. From my law school in the United States, that wasn't the case. It was, very, very fine areas of practice, right? Corporations law, business, criminal law, but human rights law would have been unusual to see 50% of the students interested in that. So I think it's a really important part of our law school. And I've spent the last 26 years engaging in the law in a very, very critical way to see how the law both reflects the kind of stereotypes and discrimination that people face, but also tries to address it. So the law is really multifaceted. You have to look at it very critically, because the law sometimes does bad things, right? It allowed for the residential school system. It allowed for slavery. It allowed for Japanese internment. It allowed for really racist immigration policies in Canada and the United States. And those were all legal concepts that oppressed people. And so some might think, well, why should we study law if it's oppressive to others? And the truth is, it has been used to denigrate people in favor of white supremacy. But at the same time, it's got tools that people can use to address those same systemic problems. There has to be some receptiveness in the legislature and in the courts, but there also has to be receptiveness in the law schools to teach our students that they can use these tools to do right. And that's what we're hoping to instill in our students at Ryerson Law.
From a very practical, on the ground viewpoint, how do you do that?
You insert it into your curriculum. So one of the things that I'm looking forward to is working with our new faculty members. Everyone's new. we just got our faculty together 2 weeks ago, but there was a lot of build up to that. But look at their research interests and their teaching interests, and working with them to insert kinds of, the teachings from the very first day. So right now we're hoping to, integrate Indigenous legal practices and laws into our first year curriculum. We have faculty members right now who have been engaged in critical analysis of certain areas of law that they will certainly be inserting into their teaching. And we've designed some courses specifically to get to some of the historical problems with the law and to address them. So it's not hard to do. It's much easier to do with a new law school in certain ways, because we're not fighting against, kind of tradition, right? We're starting afresh. And because it was part of the founding kind of, the raison d'etre for the law school, it's going to be easy to do. Anyone who's hired into the faculty knows that this is our approach and this is what we're looking for, and they're embracing it. And the student, this is what we promised. We promised the public that this is what we would do, and we promised our students, and they want us to do that. And it's really necessary, regardless. It's a good, rounded legal education. I think all schools should be doing this.
Another value proposition with the law school has to do with digital innovation. And, you're dealing with, I don't need to tell you, but a field that still employs fax machines. And I'm wondering if what role you see Ryerson's Law School playing in pushing the practical aspect of the law forward into the 21st century.
Well, yeah, we have to, right? One of the things that the pandemic has shown is some of the practices in the practice of law, some of the kind of the weaknesses in what it is we expect in legal practice. And this is not to say that law firms and other legal actors are unaware of any of this, but the law is a very, I'm going to say conservative. I don't mean politically conservative. I mean conservative in that it's very incremental. The change is incremental by design, right? We are always looking backwards in order to decide how to deal with the current situation. So we're looking at precedent all the time. So if there's going to be an area of employment, law is going to be one of one of the areas that is kind of resistant to some of the changes. And so what we're doing at Ryerson is we are training our students to embrace technology. And there are lots of really interesting technological changes in law, and the Legal Innovation Zone, for example, at Ryerson it's a tech incubator for folks who want to use technology to kind of bring the practice of law into the 21st century. And so what we're trying to do with our students is encourage them to use technology in ways that facilitate the practice of law and representing their clients and their communities. But at the same time, it's really important to be critical of technology. Not all technology is good, right? Or is used in a good way. Facebook was momentous, and we've seen how it can be abused. And so all technology has to be first understood and then made sure, and then critiqued so as to ensure that it's being used for the good of society.
Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. The last 4 or 5 months have been so eye-opening and so revealing. And people do say that it's an accelerant. Things that were sort of moving in one direction are now getting there faster. What interesting things have you seen in the world of the law, either the Canadian system or the American system, that have been sped up or changed or sort of mutated through the course of the pandemic, for better or for ill?
Yeah, I'm going to focus on one thing. I think there are other ways that this has changed, but the one that I'm most intrigued about is having hearings done the way we're talking right now, via Zoom. Mm-hmm. And it intrigues me because, we have this technology that can you imagine having to be in lockdown and try to do your job 20 or 25 years ago without this kind of technology? It would be a very, very different way of doing your job. I think, I don't know that we could do it all by telephone, right? So it's an incredible technological innovation to be able to operate in this way. And I think that it's also, it'll produce some efficiencies in the legal system so that, we don't have lawyers and clients sitting out in the hallway of a courtroom or a courthouse waiting for their case, right? It'll produce some efficiencies. And I also think that it'll provide more access in some ways. I'm wary. I want to see how this works, because I think that even though the technology is fantastic and we're using it, it's very two-dimensional. And I'm not sure that all of the very subtle things that happen with normal human communication, the cues that we pick up by being in the same room with other people, the expressions that we see in, our classrooms, in our, on our students' faces in our classrooms, or in the jury, or in the audience. I'm not sure that I think all of those things are really important. And so if we are going to transfer technology into, transfer law practice into this environment, I think we have to be very, very careful that we're doing that for the right reason. So I don't know that, for example, murder trials should be done this way, but maybe, kind of more minor motions can be done this way. I would hate to see this become the norm. In any, teaching classes, I would hate to see that this become the norm. We need that interaction.
So let me ask you, given your interest in labor law, we've spent the last few months banging pots on our porches to celebrate frontline workers. There was a brief period when grocery store clerks had a bump in pay, and then it went down again. I'm wondering if you think our society has learned any lessons about labor, the value of labor, the importance of the people who practice really like super important jobs in our society. Will there be any long-term effect or implication on this focus on the frontline worker?
Okay, so I am an eternal optimist when it comes to this, but I'm also very critical. It's maybe not the most healthy combination. I think that the fact that we have banging of pots on the streets is absolutely fabulous. And I think it will lead to an awareness of what people face in non-COVID times, right? I think that some of our workers they've always been exposed to dangerous working conditions, discrimination, harassment. The working conditions of people vary, but the kinds of negative conditions that they are exposed to, I think that's almost universal. I don't think there is a job really on the planet that doesn't come with some really negative consequences with it. It could be safety and health, but it could also be sexual harassment or discrimination. And so I think that we are in a moment where we're really appreciating the importance of a lot of the jobs that people do and the conditions that they face. And what I think is really required, because remember, the law doesn't change as fast as it really should. And so I think we need to keep up our activism and translate those, banging of the pots into real change, into real activism, into lobbying our legislatures to do something about wages and working conditions. And I'm hoping that will happen. It doesn't have to take hundreds of thousands of people. It just has to take a group of people dedicated and learned in the areas to move, and committed and vitally committed to making change, to push our legislators and our lawmakers to do something about it. So there's my optimism. I'm hoping that this will be a moment where we understand the importance of activism, really.
Well, speaking of activism, I'd love to know how you personally experienced the Black Lives Matter uprising over the last few months. What your lived experience was of it? Did you participate? How did you feel watching it? And then do you believe that all of that will have lasting positive impact?
So I think Black Lives Matter has already had lasting impact. I cannot tell you how surprising it is to have, cities in Alabama taking down Confederate statues and taking down the Confederate part of the Confederate flag. I mean, it's unbelievable. Like you would not believe that this would have been possible. And I think that is Black Lives Matter and other activism. I was in Albany New York, during the first set of protests around the George Floyd death. And I participated, and it was really interesting because it was one of those events that because it was during COVID lockdown, it was risky. People were going and marching in, and it was risky to do this. And we all knew that that was true. So it was very interesting how it was organized. This was in Albany, New York. There was a lot of social distancing, not a lot of people banging up against each other. Everyone was wearing a mask, and we couldn't stay home. We had to go out and protest because—
What did it feel like?
It felt, after being locked in the house for months, it felt fantastic to see that people were out there and that they cared, and that what happened to George Floyd and others was absolutely unacceptable. We should not allow that thing to happen. Now, this has been happening for centuries in the United States and in Canada. We have had vigilantism, we've had police brutality, we've had killing of Indigenous and racialized people. We have had this. This is state-sanctioned violence against communities of color for various reasons, lots of different reasons, but white supremacy being, the main reason. And it felt, I've been to protests my entire life. I've been trying to get, to instill in my students a sense of activism. Get out there. The law is not going to help solve everything. You got to do that in a different way. You've got to use your learning and your talents and your skill and your energy to go out and petition your government, right? Get out on the streets and scream, because some things are really, really worth screaming about. And police violence against Black and Brown people and Indigenous communities is worth screaming against. We have to change that system. So it felt great to do it. And I feel a new sense of hope, because things have changed. And if they can change in the Deep South in the United States, they can change anywhere. And we've seen ripple effects here in Canada and in other parts of the States. There is a dialogue that is opening up in a different way, but that's not all we have to do. We've got a lot of work to do. There are lots of really unfair laws that we need to change, but it's a start.
Given your faith in the power of the law and your love of the law, do you sometimes feel a tension between the activists who say the entire system is unjust and totally dysfunctional and hopeless, and then another camp that says, let's use the law to make our institutions better?
There's absolutely a tension there, and there's a tension within me. That same tension lives within me, because there are, when you look at I've been teaching in the United States for 26 years, so I have a really clear picture of how the US Constitution was built on the oppression of other people. So the very document that people use as the example of enlightened, equality among people was actually a document that was a bitter compromise that allowed for slavery, that encouraged slavery in many ways. And it took 150 years to change that more. And then another 100 years to try to address through the legal system all of the historical wrongs that the Constitution and that the laws that were put in place had caused. So at some points you look at a system and you say, you gotta just, get rid of it. You've got to start from, you dismantle it, just get rid of it. And I think there are areas of law that are certainly more susceptible to that kind of critique. But at the same time, the principles that you find in the law are also principles that we can use to address the very same weaknesses in the law, and we should do that. So I love the law, but I'm extraordinarily critical of it. And I do believe that that the law is not the answer, that we need activism. We need a lot of pressure coming from people who are experiencing the law in different ways to tell us what it is, or what they're experiencing, and how the law is being used to oppress them. So again, it's a tension. I'm not always comfortable with that tension. I recognize the tension, and I would like to bring our students and our faculty and our staff along with me to try to address this in our new institution.
You mentioned you mentioned the American Constitution, and I'm wondering what sort of challenges and also opportunities you see in transitioning back to Canada. It's a different legal system, of course, different history, different culture, different learning environment. What do you imagine the changes and differences will be, and how do you plan to approach it?
Well, Canada is familiar to me. I mean, I did grow up here, so it's not kind of, it's never been foreign. But it was interesting because 26 years ago when I moved to the US, I had been trained in law in Canada, and then I taught law in the United States. And so there was this, it was a steep learning curve. The principles are all, based on, common law principles, so it's easy to just kind of transition. But there were significant doctrinal and cultural differences between the two systems. And so I was looking at the American system very, very critically. I had a different way of looking at the law. It was the law of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada and the way it was being interpreted. And so I was really critical, and I was trying to encourage this kind of understanding that the US legal system really ought to look to international sources to help solve some of their intractable problems. So if you go to the South African Constitution, for example, South Africa can be a quagmire in some ways, but it also has a very enlightened constitution, much more enlightened than the US Constitution, which has been interpreted in a very, very narrow way that doesn't always work to the benefit of oppressed people. And so, so what I'm learning here is that Canada and the US are very, very similar in many, many ways, right? We have very similar histories of oppressing people of color and Indigenous people, very similar. And so all of the things that we can learn from the experiences across borders, and we should be doing that. So the system is different. I'm learning things every day. I'm learning at slightly different things about how law schools typically function and et cetera. But it's fascinating, and I think that I now have kind of two systems to look at, take out the pieces that I think are better from both systems, and then combine them into this wonderful law school and see what happens.
You've been very generous with your time, and I won't take up too much more of it, but I did want to ask you what it has been like to set up a law school in a pandemic when you can't gather for, at the pub with your new faculty.
I know, I'm so sad about that. I really am. I had 2 months on campus, and in those 2 months, I was able to meet literally dozens and dozens of people, both in the legal community and internally to Ryerson. And so it was I feel fortunate that I at least had those 2 months. Some people have started their new jobs completely online. Transitioning was really, it was destabilizing, right? Everything had to be now done at a distance. So there was no way of going across the hallway and talking to the folks that I needed help with, because I needed a lot of help. And everything had to be planned. We had to have Zoom meetings or telephone calls. Everything had to be scheduled. There was no spontaneity. And now that we've brought in a new faculty, I'm finding it, I'm desperate to see them in real life, right? Just to hang out for a coffee at a distance and talk and chat, but everything has to be, scheduled. So it is challenging already to set up a new law school from scratch. Not quite from scratch. There was a lot of work done before I got here by faculty and the university. So a lot of work before I arrived. But putting it all together has been a challenge. But I have to say that the people that I am working with are the most spectacular people I've ever worked with. They are so committed. If you are part of the law school, it's because you absolutely want to be part of this, right? You're excited about it. You've left your other position to join us so that we can build something together. If you are a student coming to the law school, it's because you want to be part of building the program from the ground up. You want to have influence in it. You're excited about the prospect. If you are a faculty member that's coming to this law school, as opposed to kind of a more established law school, it's because you want to be part of that. So everyone that is involved in the law school is extraordinarily excited and committed to making it work. And that's the most wonderful thing to be able to work with. So even though we're at a distance for now, it's temporary. I have not felt, I mean, I am kind of over the top excited about the team that we've built and that we've put together, and the amazing things that we're going to do.
And what does the fall look like class-wise?
The fall looks like it might be a combination of on-campus classes and activities and online or remote classes and activities. We're not requiring anyone to either attend classes or work or teach on campus. No one is required to do that. So we're going to make sure that people have choices. And in order to make sure that people have choices, we have to set up a very robust system that will allow professors to work completely remotely if they want, and students to work remotely. And also, for those who want to be on campus, there has to be a way of engaging with the students who are not going to be on campus. So I'm concerned about kind of an equitable educational environment between the students on campus and the ones who are not going to be able to join us on campus. And we're putting together a program that we are going to, that really is going to address all of those interests. So we're still in the planning stages. We're not quite there yet. We're waiting to hear what we can and cannot do. We're trying to be as nimble as possible. We are not an enormous law school. We only have, 150 or so students, very small faculty. We can be nimble. If we need to start on campus, we can do that, and then we can switch, or vice versa. So we are going to be nimble. And the students, by the way, who we have surveyed, are phenomenal. They're very forgiving. They're very patient. They're happy to join us. And also they recognize how difficult a situation this is. And they're just, I think, really excited about the possibility.
Amazing. Well, I wish you great good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to all of our audience members at Toronto Life. This has been a real pleasure. Thanks. I hope to meet you in person at some point.
I certainly do too. Thank you so much.
Bye for now.
Bye.